the sub, un, and infraconsciousness regions, but that that's one of the elements that the Kabbalistic teachings point to, that as we go through our lives and we create and have the psychology of accumulation and our desire, which is never really satisfied through gratification, it just grows. It grows and it grows and it grows. And what happens is we begin to populate and overpopulate our psychology, our psyche, our processing of thinking and feeling. And what happens is we begin to populate denser and denser and denser realms. And so we're not really getting into that in this course too much. This time we've really shrunk it down to just 5 weeks and trying to deal with what's practical, and trying to make everything practical and simple in a sense, without, you know, sacrificing everything that's traditionally known as the study of Kabbalah. But in that, this expression of what's taking place can be seen as a direct consequence of a psychology of isolation and separation, that we're continually going through the world and saying mine, 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 yes, no, and we're continually adjusting reality according to our own psychology. And the Gnostic teachings or the Kabbalistic teachings on that, what happens is we do that inside of ourselves. We push ourselves further and further away. So this social distancing is actually a reflection of a psychological distancing that we do. And so it's very interesting, the situation, as we've said before. It's terrible in a sense that the whole world is going through this, but it's also a grace. It's a mercy that this wave of call for us to look at ourselves in the way that we think, feel, and act, by removing all of the other elements and stimulus and just being with ourselves, relatively speaking. What's that like? And I don't know, for you guys, the communications we've had, I know you have a lot of communications with people that are working from home, that are having to spend, you know, time with the family and the home that you work so hard to create, but can't get away from. It creates a different relationship, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, divorce rates have really spiked, you know, in the last month, unfortunately. So yeah, the heat is on. Mm-hmm.
So the call and our next course, as we're preparing for that next course, there's been a little alteration in the title. We haven't put it out yet. We're not. In the old days, we make flyers, and then 3 weeks or 4 weeks before that, you know, that may be something that's changed completely. We, you know, going to put flyers, actual pieces of paper, in coffee shops and bookstores. But the title is A Distant Call to Awaken, Ancient Wisdom for the Modern Times. And we're going to talk about and look at ancient teachings, First Nations teachings, and actually we would say, what would be before First Nations? It would be pre-nations. You know, we're going to go try to look at the teachings that come sort of from the origin of this humanity, some of the ancient teachings, and hopefully shed some light in a way that's very illuminating. And we're going to draw from the Mayan tradition, and there's a wealth of information that, if we know how to look at it. But there's something very interesting that comes to the top of my mind, not to spoil the class, but maybe to entice, to market for, but that in the Mayan tradition, in the Popol Vuh, it talks about humanities previous to this, that cycled, where the divine had tried to create people so that there was a direct relationship or an interaction between the divine. It said to track time and to worship. We need some context to really understand this, but what's very interesting is it tells these stories of, in a very short form, of the beginning and ending of these people. And they're just blurbs, like, you know, on the internet, it'd be just a blurb, and you're like, you easily look over that. But in those traditions, like the Kabbalistic tradition that we're studying now, it was a storytelling tradition. As a matter of fact, the Bible itself and the ancient scriptures, this is hard to imagine, but for thousands of years, it said, it was a word of mouth tradition, that they didn't even actually have the Bible or the scriptures written down. It was told as stories, just like much of the First Nations peoples that tell stories through song and through dance. And as a matter of fact, in those ancient traditions, they didn't even have a word for song, because language was singing, and everybody sung. We would say, I don't sing, and I don't.
You do.
I do, just terribly. That's the thing. Everybody sings. Everyone makes a sound. Everyone has a song. Everyone has a story. And so these ancient traditions come, and they're just blurbs that they eventually written down. And here's something very fascinating. I'm not giving that course yet, but as I'm starting to talk about it, it's something very interesting that the way we think and feel in this modern civilization is, and try to look back and view people from the way that we think now. For instance, one of the things that we say, science looks back and says, well, this culture entered into civilization because it started to write down. It had a written language. So as if that was a point that the people jumped into, or the pre-people jumped into peoplehood, like, oh, they have a written language. But in these ancient traditions and teachings, it said that once the people lost the power of the word, lost the capacities of the mind to tell the truth and to remember, they had to start writing down. So writing down was actually, in ancient traditions, seen as a degeneration or an involution of a people. Just like the use of tools, where we look back and say the use of tools is a sign that these people, you know, became civilized. But in reality, from these ancient traditions, a use of tools meant that they no longer had the capacity to control matter. A use of weapons meant that they no longer had the capacity of peace. So the way that we go back and gauge ancient cultures and progress are actually signs of a decline of a people. And that we, from the Gnostic teachings, from the Kabbalistic teachings, and from these ancient teachings, that we are a people in decline. And because we're in the middle of it, we don't see it that way. We don't see it that way. So that's some of the things that we're going to talk about. And I know that those ideas might be like, whoa, wait a minute, that's not, you're gonna have to back that up. Mm-hmm. We'll try. We'll try and put our modern mind in a way to relate to the ancient thinkings. But the one thing that I wanted to say, in these stories of the Popol Vuh that tells the decline of a people, it says that there was this one humanity where the animals began to rise up and speak to the people, and all of their cooking utensils and tools turned against them. The animals and the tools that they were using turned against them and began to destroy them. Now, we think back from our modern mind and go, oh, these primitive people, what kind of message are they talking? But if we can understand and use our imagination that these people maybe were much more civilized and much more intelligent and much more awake than we can comprehend, they're telling us in a simple way, just like this: we contracted a virus from animals that are that's battling against us. The plastics and the things that we've created are beginning to destroy the world and destroy ourselves. I mean, maybe just a few words like that, and you can go, oh, it's not that difficult to comprehend, but we have to change the paradigm with which we see the past. One of the great, it was said, the great destructive elements that the Western world brought was the Gregorian calendar and the tracking of linear time. Because with that, we inherently believe that we're moving forward. It's just an illusion, though, that we're moving forward in time. So whatever was behind us was in the past. It was old, it's antiquated. When these ancient traditions and these people, our people, our ancestors, understood time as cycles, continual cycles of rising and falling, rising and falling. So we'll look at the Mayan calendar, we'll look at the Aztec sunstone calendar and try to bring some light to that. So I feel, we said this in relation to this topic, the Kabbalah, and that topic when at the beginning or the end of last year, we were planning our calendar, you know, our linear calendar. What are we going to do in the future? Because our calendars are, right? They're blocks, they're not circles. But we were planning it, and then as this circumstance arose in the planet, and we've continued online, but we asked ourselves, are these topics relevant? Are they useful? Are they going to shed light on what's going on right now? Is it relevant to what we're going through? And yes, it actually is. It actually is absolutely relevant on a bigger scale than we may see. So we're just going to bring some information in relation to the Gnostic teachings on the current times as a humanity that we're going through, because these ancient cultures saw things in much bigger perspectives than we do, and had a much deeper love and compassion for all beings, past and future. And so much of what they did in their writings in stone were for us now, for a time when they knew that humanity would be declining, that our word doesn't have the strength and the weight that it used to. Our memory, our presence, our consciousness is not as strong as it was. And so they gave us indications to not only help us to awaken, but to remind us of what comes from being asleep. Because they were on the precipice, or they were on the crossing of the ending of a civilization and the beginning of a civilization. So that's enough for that right now. Let's not freak everybody out. Yeah, there's time. There's so much time. So much time.
So just a reminder that we're recording the audio and the presentation and just the presenter view, so you can see Jeff speaking, but we hit pause if you do ask a question. If you want to come in verbally and ask a question, I'll hit pause and control that, and we don't show you on video. So please don't be shy about asking questions, and we'll pause a couple of times if there are questions. And you can also type your questions into the chat if you have access to that, but send it either to everyone or to Judith, because I'm the one monitoring the chat. And so I'm logged in as Judith, which is my name. So logged in as Judith, right. Yeah, so if you want to send a question just privately, then send it to me, and I'll include it when we pause for questions. Yeah.
Give me a second to appropriate. Oh, look at this. That seems a little weird. If you guys could only see what I see. Okay. So we tonight are towards the end of this course, as it were. And it's always a struggle. For me, it's a struggle. And anyone that's read any of Master Samael's works, you'll see that he gives so much information and so much teaching in these books. And he wrote so many books. And for some people that haven't studied a lot, it may seem like it's all over the place and he's pulling from all sorts of things. And you might say that too when I'm talking too. But it's elements that cross over between cultures and teachings that I find it helpful to bring in many things, such as the Kabbalistic teachings that we're talking about. I bring in a lot from the East because it helps to overlap and fill in certain gaps that were put in the esoteric teachings that you're not going to find without years and years and years and years of studying with a master, probably, to get these certain elements. That some of it's come out in the open and on the internet, and you can read stuff, but what you don't get in the internet, and why we say we're not an online school, but you could argue differently because here we are online. And we may be this way for a while. So some people may see, yeah, okay, the handshake went away, but that Gnostic center, it's crossing borders. And so we have the benefit of studying with, we could say, masters or teachers that have not just studied. And this is something that we need to really comprehend and understand moving forward, that we cannot, and it's funny, back class 1, we always start the Kabbalistic class with this phrase that comes from Master Samael, that there's 2 types of Kabbalists, intellectual and intuitive. But to know the difference, it's not that easy. We can think, well, we're studying intuitive knowledge, gnosis, so we're studying esoteric topics from the point of intuition, but we're only doing that from the abilities that we have to connect internally with these things. And it's always the struggle to teach and to study. I was going to say to study is to not let information stop at the intellect. I showed last week a prism briefly. I don't know if I spoke about it too much, but a prism where pure light enters into a prism and it divides into seven rays. Or we would look at the first origin of that. The white comes into the 3 primary colors of blue, yellow, and red. And we show that relationship also to the tree of life, as the blue here of the Father, it's not blue on this one, yellow relates to the sun, or the second force of Chokmah, and red to the force of the Holy Spirit, or Binah, which is understanding. But in relation to this, as light enters in, it gets diffused, separated, projected out. And those rays of white light then are organized, and then the order of the electromagnetic spectrum of the 7 colors of the rainbow, as we say. And that in the absolute relationship of creation, you see on this tree of life 3 at the top, the law of 3, and then 7 below dot here that shows that relationship of the 3 that creates and the 7 that orders. And that those 7 rays that come from the pure white light relate to 7 divine archangels, which we briefly talked about in last class, because we're trying to make it as practical as necessary. Do we need to memorize intellectually all the spheres and the archangels and the legions of angels and the names of God? No, yeah, I hope not, because it's not an intellectual didactic or study that needs to be. We touch on them just because it's part of the teaching, but now we have to understand that and always apply it towards ourselves. So when wisdom as light comes through a teaching, through a word, through a teacher, through an experience, it also goes into us and gets fractioned and spread out. So the pure, the medium through which that intelligence goes through, the more pure the reflection or the expression of that inside of our psyche. So at first it seems a little difficult to keep an open mind. And when I say open mind, I think we think, oh yeah, I have an open mind, I'll listen to what you have to say. But really an open mind is open and it stays open, and it allows the information to go in and process through without associating, grabbing, holding, not quenching, but squinting on it, you know, as our mind, like, what? He said, what? Because as we do that, it traps, it fractions knowledge, and it keeps it conditioned. And sometimes that condition is in a condition that I don't understand what he said, or I don't understand what they're talking about, or it's jumping around. The reality is, to keep an open mind is to allow that information to pass and let it go by, which means we may not intellectually understand what's being said right away. And that's okay. That's absolutely okay. And we would say that it's actually, for the most part, necessary. It's necessary to comprehend and understand new ideas and new concepts. Because if we try to accustom any information that comes in to a concept that we already have, we're conditioning the information that we're coming, and we're creating new formations for that knowledge to be put in that may or may not be true. One of the common things that's said in the Gnostic teachings is that we all have what's called a bad secretary. Imagine some individual, a guy seated at a desk that's just filtering in information continually. All the images, and it's interesting, we have a young grandchild who's just learning words. So he, in the moment, is continually, he walks into a room and he's green, blue, truck, dog, and he's just naming off things, and you know, he feels pretty good about it, and it's great. But as we get more complicated in life, and we're doing that same thing, and we're throwing things in all sorts of places that they don't belong, according to what we call the bad secretary, which is our ego, our desire. So according to relativity and duality, we move information around and we put it in places and we forget things because we associate them with wrong things. And the real understander of information should be the consciousness. And in the tree of life, here, the consciousness is expressed in two elements. Here in Tiferet, which is known as the human consciousness, often called the human soul. And here in Geburah, which is the divine consciousness, or often called the spiritual soul. So we're way down here in Malkuth, receiving impressions through the senses. And our mind, our emotions, and our actions and our words are accustomed to the formations in the physical world. And we're usually automatically feeling something about it, thinking something about it, remembering, recalling, and we're not allowing that information to go all the way up into the true opportunity to comprehend something into the consciousness. Now, at first, it feels a little like a free fall. And I always use this analogy when I was learning to snowboard, that you slice back and forth. It's called carving down the mountain, and you probably know this. Either skiing, I think skiing's similar, but snowboarding. But the thing that was very difficult to learn was that you come to the edge and you have to turn towards the mountain, towards the downside of the mountain, and actually free fall for a second. And then you go to the other side and you do it again. And you're sort of, carrying out controlled falling. And you start to learn how to put your back foot into the ground to steer and control and to slow down, and you learn how you can control, but there's always this element of falling. The acquisition of knowledge is very similar to that. We do not take in new knowledge unless we have a moment of unknowing. As long as we know what we're saying, what we're hearing, what we're doing, we're fractioning the information as it's coming in. So Gnostic Teachings 101 states that humanity as a whole, but more importantly, you, I, are asleep. We talk asleep, we walk asleep, we drive asleep. We carry out most of our actions in an asleep state, meaning while I'm doing one thing, I'm thinking of something else. I'm feeling something else. And that's what the Tree of Life helps us to understand, is that there's all these different parts, and each of these different spheres and sephiras and parts also have more and more sub-parts. So we're going to look at the fractioning of the consciousness, the subconsciousness, and we don't have to understand all these levels directly. First, we have to understand when we're there and when we're not there. Because we can only begin to awaken when we realize that we're asleep. And we can only realize that we're asleep through direct experience, through directly experiencing the lack of our consciousness in a given moment. And that Gnosis gives us not just this condemnation as myself that I'm asleep, but it gives us the keys that once I realize this, the keys to awaken. And it's not a matter of changing thoughts about consciousness, changing material thoughts for spiritual thoughts. No, it's changing the process which we think and perceive. So that's why we teach at the very foundation and throughout a form of mindfulness that we call subject-object location, which is dividing the attention. And so now I invite you, as generally we do, to become aware of yourself. Become aware of yourself perceiving what you're seeing. So your objective is to be aware of the objects that you may have in your hand, the screen that you may be looking at, as well as yourself as the subject or the one perceiving. So your perception and your reception of information. So continue to try and feel yourself perceiving the words that are coming, the images that may be there. Now, in this didactic, there isn't really a space for the thoughts and feelings, because we're present, observing. So when a thought arises, as if a word comes in, such as elephant. Now, I just said elephant out of the blue. And I bet it triggered an image of an elephant, or, oh, what? Or who knows? You know, each of you to observe, but notice when that information comes in and wants to be diverted out from the present. To maintain the state of awareness of, I'm perceiving through my five senses, and I'm receiving in my consciousness, myself as the observer, in the place where I am. So that I'm holding this. And you can see that if I hold the state of subject, myself, object, what I'm doing, location, expanding to take in the place through which I'm doing it, so that I can be focused on one thing, but in my periphery, I'm aware of what's happening also. If I do that, it sort of covers every base that could arise, so that in my periphery, as I engage this way, my thoughts and feelings actually arise in that periphery, not in the physical, but in the astral or mental planes, which are around me. And the more I try to keep myself in this state, the more I will start to see my thoughts or hear my thoughts. Now in meditation, as we work, this becomes really, really practical. So simply, we work with subject-object location to be as present continually as we can. And then at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day, and if you're fortunate, sometimes in the middle of the day, we do a meditation practice to focus our attention more by limiting the relationship of the information that we're taking in, by closing our eyes, sitting in a silent space. So that our meditation practice then feeds our awareness, our self-observation practice, and our self-observation practice feeds our meditation practice. And we start to create a cohesion or a constancy in our work, and then we can deepen within that. We're going to look more into this next week. We're going to look at imagination more specifically, inspiration and intuition, but we're going to touch on this now as we go through this process. But try to maintain this state without allowing a thought that comes into your mind to become thinking, where our attention actually goes, And we can imagine, I like to use visual elements, like a thought comes into my mind and I go, You know, because that's kind of what we do. We turn towards the thought, or towards the feeling. And we start allowing that to elaborate inside of ourselves. Now, the very wonderful thing is that the thinking and feeling does not need us to be present. But it's almost as if it demands us to be with it. But that's the interesting thing, is we don't have to. If we can keep our awareness separated, imagine this reality, which is an actual possibility, that you're talking, you're listening, you're present, and your mind is thinking parallel to what you're doing, so that you're perceiving your thinking without being identified or pulled away from the present moment. That is a state that's very important for us to try to imagine. Don't think about it. It's only something that arises. The states of consciousness really only arise in the moment. Thinking about them doesn't get there. It's like, I'm going to think about being in love. That's totally different than being in love. And actually, there's a difference between love as an object, and like I love humanity, and then actually loving. To actually be in love, that's an action of the consciousness that acts through the will, through the heart. And to be in that state is actually a connection to the divine. That love, human love, is actually a fraction of pure spiritual divine love. It's one of the great graces that we have in this world, is to experience that. Love different than desire. Because as I tried to show in one of these clips of the relationships of the magnets, that electromagnetic field of attraction held in the proper proportion allows an electromagnetic movement of energy. And if we can keep the right proportion to everything that we're thinking, seeing, perceiving, it will naturally produce light or electricity inside of us. And that light or electricity actually is the energy of intuition. It is the arc of light that connects 2 points. Like remember the old Frankenstein movie with the big bars and where the electricity goes across? That's taking place in the internal worlds. Light, due to proximity of elements, the correct proportion. And proximity relates directly to the class that we're going to talk about tonight. Holding that proximity, because if we are too far apart where we don't feel the attraction or the influence of an element, it doesn't produce that electricity. Now, me, though the people I work with may beg to differ, but I am an electrician. They would say, well, you haven't done an electricianing in quite a while. Well, that's kind of true. I don't go out in the field as much as I used to, but I think that way, and I understand, and you may have, an exercise that you could do, if you had, especially if you're in an old house, you have a switch and you slowly turn the switch on, especially if it's old, you could find a gap where it actually opens enough and is closed enough that it arcs and it flashes. We have to be able to find that with our consciousness. That's why we don't, as Master Samael says, the teachings tell us, don't identify with things. Because when we identify with something, we stop the ability for that light to be transferred from that element to ourselves. Because the light, the consciousness, the information in the internal dimensions is what we're after. In the physical world, through our senses and our mind tied to the physical world, actually what it's after is the sensation. So we get trapped in that wanting the sensation, wanting the gratification of the sensation, and we lose at the expense of that the acquisition of light or consciousness. And we do this not just with the physical senses, because once we start to perceive with our consciousness, it doesn't matter if we're physically touching something or not, we can still process that information in the consciousness by holding a psychological separation from the event that we're experiencing. And yes, at first, we're not going to get flashes of light bombarding us like giant explosions of comprehension. It would be nice if that was the case, but we have to learn, we have to flex the consciousness like it's a muscle to learn how to hold at a distance and at the right distance our experiences at the correct proximity. So I in one way or another am sort of demystifying the English language, yes. I'm demystifying this very abstract world of the Kabbalah known as Atziluth, which is a Hebrew word which means proximity. So
There's no questions.
no questions. There's no questions on chat, so we're just going to keep trudging ahead, as it were. But you're always welcome to send a question on chat that Judith's feverishly monitoring and working off to the side. We've decided, we decide, like when she teaches, sometimes I'm here just going, you know, and the beauty is that it's better for me to step off camera, as it were, or her to step off camera, so that you're not distracted with their intense experiencing of a class and wondering, when is she going to say something? Well, when she comes back to the seat. So now you know. Okay, this was not, a button got pushed when I wasn't attempting to push the button, but we're going to get right back. Hey, it did it. Did you see that? I didn't intend it to, but it just flashed electricity. Oh my goodness. Now we're all over the place. Sit tight, everyone. I'm going to, Judith's going to come in. She's going to say something profound.
I don't know if I'll say anything profound, but now would be a good time for a break. And we're also about an hour in. So if you want a stretch break, if you want a beverage break, if you want a bathroom break, a bio break. You? Would you like a break?
I mean, I should keep going.
Okay.
I'd love a break, though.
All right. So now, well, if you want a break, take a
Okay.
break. Yeah.
I'll take a break.
You would love a break.
I'm going to stretch too. I'm going to, what do you call this? Demonstrate
Yeah.
what you can or should do. I'm going to go for a walk. I don't know if this makes for good TV. So let us look at these four worlds that we talked about. And if you're just joining us here and haven't gone through the other classes, it might be helpful to go back. But there's four worlds, as it were, different aspects of these teachings that interlay over. And we've gone from the bottom up, from the world of matter and action, which is Asya in the purple at the bottom. That this tree of life here relates to just this Sephira, the sphere here, which is the Sephira of Asya, which is the physical reality, the physical world that receives all the forces from the superior dimensions to give form and organization in this physical world. Now, in the past, when we've given this course, we started in the world of Atziluth and worked down, because really the world of Asya is the result of all the transformations of the previous worlds. But we began at the bottom for two reasons. One, the topic or the title of the course is Climbing the Tree of Life. So, you know, it wouldn't be fair if we started climbing from the top. That's not the way climbing works. So we wanted to start from the bottom and build and build and build and build. But even more so, in the way that we express this course, is we could say initiatic Kabbalah, because it's a process of psychologically developing and building. So as we talk about these different realms, we're talking about the things as they've moved down, but we're doing it from the point of view as we're going up. And we're going to do that again tonight. But remember that the energy flows in the tree of life from the top to the bottom. So from absolute abstract space before creation, it descends like a lightning bolt in this fashion here, as you see my pointer going down. And sometimes you'll see the trees with that drawn on it. And actually, as I showed the world's unfolding, it did this throughout all of the trees. And we can visualize or imagine each of the sephiras of the worlds as cups that are being filled with light. And as they're filled, they overflow and give to the next, continually unfolding and overflowing until it reaches the world of Asya. But actually, as far as the divine light descends, really the place that it concludes is here in Tiferet, which is the world of Bria, which we talked about last week. Because after that, the energy then goes into these lower worlds through Tiferet, and that actually Malkuth, this physical world that we live in now and gather all of our information from, is the one Sephira that Tiferet is not directly connected to. As you see, these 8 spokes that connect it to every other Sephira, so that our consciousness is not involuntary connected. So to be in the physical world, we don't have to have consciousness present. It's not a requirement. It's beneficial for us as the individuals, but as we become accustomed, and we have to, as I said, eat, drink, drive, walk, asleep, it starts to become a mechanical process. And so of expression. And so that we might even think in the inverse way that, well, I want to be conscious, and all I have to do then is think about it. And the more I think about it, the more my consciousness is going to turn on, and eventually it's going to turn on and never turn off. But you have to understand, for a person, for a planet, for a civilization, that's not possible. It's because consciousness itself is not a mechanical action or reaction, that it's always going to take effort at some level to keep the consciousness present and awake.
Will. Actual will. Not the will of just self-will grit, but a different kind of will that emerges from the consciousness itself. You know, the will that is the same will from which unconditional love comes, and the natural sacrifices that result from love. That's real will. You know, it's not like I'm going to do this, not of self-will, but it's more of a magnetism. Mm-hmm.
And the elements of the physical world continually should call us to be present. For instance, subject, object, location. I mentioned object. Now, you playing along at home, probably your hands are pretty empty because you're just watching, but you might have a cup of tea, you might have a pencil to write with. I began, and I had this stylus in my hand. So I'm aware of the object, so that whenever I set an object down, I make a note consciously. I am setting this object down. I'm picking up this bottle. Because just like consciousness is not mechanical, it's continually being fed information. Objects are continually moving. And we don't normally become aware of all of that. Why we lose our keys, why we lose things all the time, is because we don't have our consciousness in the object as we place it or pick it up. So a side note, it's very important to have systems to help yourself. If you don't have a system, you're going to be losing things quite a bit, generally, unless you're very conscious. And even then, I think it's still very good to have a system, because then you know, and I don't know if you've ever done this, like you might know my keys go here on this hook, and I have my keys in my hand and I come in with stuff in my hands, and I think, I've done this many times, I'm going to put my keys here, I'm going to put this thing down, knowing that's not where it goes. But I know that I'm doing it. And then later on, I go to the hook and I'm like, where are my keys? Who took my keys? It's funny how the mind works like this, and it works to keep us asleep, actually. but that's another topic. So let us look at the tree of life and the different trees through the worlds as the energy descends. We'll go a little more one by one as we go, but here, Asi at the bottom, Yetzirah, or the world of formation, that relates to this tree here, that feeds into this tree. That is, each world, here Asiya is here, Yetzirah is here, has its own tree of life, as it were. And here, the world of Bria relates to this golden yellow tree here, which is the world of creation, as we talked about last week, the world of archangels, where God acts through systems and organizations, organizational elements, and through its principal administrators, which we call archangels. We tried not to get too much into the abstract nature of archangels and angels, but we did talk about that a little bit, and it is helpful. Tonight we're going to look at the world of Atziluth, which is the world of proximity, which is the divine world of archetypes where God acts directly. God acts directly. And it's a very abstract relationship, but we're going to try to make it a little concrete. It's always abstract, but a little concrete, and show some relationships to help us to understand that. So let's begin in Asiya briefly. It's the three-dimensional world. It's the world of three dimensions, and it's symbolized by a square normally. The material world is symbolized by a square, and in this case, it's a three-dimensional square. And you see at the input of this Sephira, you have this column that comes down and feeds into Malkuth. On the left, this column that comes down, and then one to the center. It's the same that we have inversely with Keter at the very top. And that's very profound, because we are a human individual in a human form that possess, in miniature, the image and likeness of the divine, meaning we express in three dimensions, and we give and receive information in three levels of organization: in the mind, in the emotions, in the body, in the actions. Those are, to a lesser degree, the expressions of the three primary forces that we call the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It is the means by which we can actually know the reality that we're living in. As I said, though, unfortunately, if our consciousness is not present, we're not really perceiving the reality. We're perceiving ourself through our mind and our sensations and our memories. So as you see that cube, it has three sides that you do not see. And those sides relate directly to the consciousness, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the three sides that we do see are our relationship in the world of Yetzirah, which is our mind, our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, and the motor, instinctive, and sexual impressions, or the body of movement. So the three faces that we see are the three elements that we perceive within the physical world. That is the way that this consciousness communicates and receives information through the physical world. As you see, these lines show the only way for the human soul to engage in the physical is either through the mind, through the motor, instinctive, sexual center, or through the emotions. We do not have a permanent vehicle for the consciousness to be in the physical world. We have barriers to that. And actually, the process of the Kabbalistic teachings of initiation is to create, through the elements of the physical world, utilizing the mind, the emotion, and the motor, instinctive, sexual centers with consciousness, we begin to create something permanent. That is what is called the great work. That's why we rely on two fundamental practices that we gave at the very beginning. The first, which we talked about now, is self-observation. Utilizing consciousness to be aware of, I'm thinking, I'm feeling, I'm doing. And the second is the relationship to the creative energy, which is at its fundamental acquisition is the use of the practice of transmutation. Because in this physical world, the one thing that we can see that science and everyone relatively agrees on, the fundamental product of life itself is to produce a seed to perpetuate life. The best of you and I is carried through our genes and through our sexual energy, which manifests into the physical sperm and ovum inside of us that contains the best of what we are. Now, that information that's fabricated in that sexual seed is formed in the world of formation in Yetzirah through all of the impressions of the mind and what we think, all of the impressions that we receive emotionally and what we feel, and all of the sensations and the information that we take in through the motor instinctive sexual center and what we do. Those three elements, why self-observation is so important, because it communicates a quality to our sexual seed. So mindfulness plays a very key important role by being aware of things that I'm attracted to and repelled by, things that are too extreme to break down, just like foods that are super, super bitter or super sweet. There's impressions that are super, super bitter and super sweet that are very difficult for us to break down. Just like I showed in an image of myself thinking, the same way that my mind deviates from being present to turn away from what's happening, to ponder a thought, which it's very fine to think when you're aware that you're thinking, but when you're doing it mechanically, it doesn't allow us to be present and take in information consciously. The same way that when I eat something sweet, I do this, and it doesn't allow me to completely digest it. And there are things like certain spices, certain foods that are too extreme that the body actually battles against. But the same thing happens with our mind and our emotions. So why we focus on self-observation and transmutation, because that's the foundation. That if we begin to do that consistently, and then build upon that and work with the prayers that we've given in the exercises and that we will give tonight, we're going to start to be communicated to at another level. The more present we are, the more information we can comprehend and take in. And the being starts to see, oh, this essence is trying to awaken, trying to be awake, which means the consciousness can see more, which means the possibility of experiencing the being at some level, and communication and communion with the being. So in this, the process is working with what's called the Stone of Yasad, which is really the formation of the sexual energy through the mind, the emotion, and the action. And in the world of Yetzirah, the Sephira that is at the base, because balance is found in the central column. So in this world of Yetzirah, the balance is on the motor instinctive sexual center, the senses and the sexual energy. And that's why in Hebrew, the name is Yesod, which means foundation. That is the foundation stone, the cubic stone or the cornerstone that is laid that all other things are built on from a Masonic teaching. And that stone in the work in the world of Bria is to be fabricated and placed a capstone on. The capstone, so like imagine the pyramid, if we were constructing a pyramid, which is a symbol. It has 4 on its base, 4 sides, and 3 sides up. That's this relationship, and it's actually the most fundamental symbol of a house. Because that house, as we've said many times, is you. When you dream about being in a house, that house is generally you. We are, to greater or lesser degrees, a temple of the divine, which is in its most basic element is a house, which is you or I. So if we were building a pyramid, you have to place one stone first in the orientation that it needs to be, which is called the cornerstone. And then you build upon that cornerstone a foundation, and upon that foundation you build the structure, and then the final piece that's placed is the capstone at the very top. It's almost like the locking part that keeps it all together. In the pyramids, that would be a gold-plated top. Now, oddly, when the pyramids that we have left today, the capstones have been taken because people see gold and, well, they want it. Because that capstone is the Trinity at the top that allows all the forces of the heavens to penetrate in. And so gold is used because it's a superior metal that relates to the solar energy, to take in solar energy and to reflect it out into the world. So in this, we have the 4 and the 3, which is these 3 in Bria, which is the intimate, called the intimate, which is Atman, or the true self. When we say self-remembering, we're speaking about remembering this self, which is Atman, or the being, the spirit, exactly, that then unfolds in the spiritual soul and the human soul. The human soul then goes into the world to experience through the mind, the emotions, and the actions, and we take that information in, if we're in a balanced state and not identified, to send that information into the being and to crystallize and to create that form, place the capstone. So in the first image that we had of the 3-dimensional cube, there's 3 sides that we see, which are our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. And there's 3 sides that you do not see, and that is the spirit, the divine soul, and the human soul. And that working through the transmutation and other exercises that we give down the line and self-observation, we give form and develop that creation in the world of Bria. So the thing that I really wanted to cover tonight is this relationship with the consciousness and how to be and maintain awareness and presence. Now, the element water is very important, and we relate to it in 2 ways. It is the sexual energy that we talked about, that all life comes from the waters of life, which are the sexual energies inside of us. But also it relates to our psychology. The waters, because in the ancient times, there weren't mirrors how you would see yourself. You'd see yourself reflected in the water. And the more pure and calm the water is, the better you can see yourself. So that's another symbol that's very important to look at in our dreams and our experiences. The element water, what's the state of that water? Is it calm? Is it turbulent? Is it dark? Is it pure? Is it clear? Does it have living food in it, dead food, algae, all of these things? But for us, in relation to this, we relate this water to the subconscious, and that it divides this plane, the plane of the mind and the plane of the emotions, into inferior and superior aspects. Somebody asked a couple classes ago about the world of the Klapoth, or the infradimensions, that it said do we experience them in the fifth dimension? Well, or the astral plane, which is the plane of emotion, what we do is we project through our waters our psychology in these lower worlds, lower parts of these planes. And the purpose of us to work to be awake is to keep our minds, our consciousness above this line in relationship. And why this is important. Let's imagine that we're perceiving from a negative state. That negative state could be impatience. Let's think for a moment today. Can we come to a point and remember a place where I felt impatient or where I felt irritated? In essence, identified in some way. So in that, we find ourselves with our awareness below this line and under the influence of the waters of our subconsciousness. And when we do that, when we perceive somebody, like this little guy here, we're perceiving through all of our own subconsciousness, through the desire of what we call the I. I'm perceiving through relativity and duality. So when I go to look at this person, what I'm actually seeing is the reflection of myself in my own waters. Now, because we're habituated to perceiving through the senses and not aware of our thinking and feeling in a real conscious way, we don't really realize that the world that we're engaged with which we talked about in the beginning with the world of Asya at the beginning of this course, that this world is illusion. And this is said through all sorts of different traditions. But part of that illusion is that I am not seeing the thing itself, I am seeing myself. Just like we said in the relationship of the colors, when we see this black bottle cover, we think, oh, that's black. But in reality, it is every other color that's being absorbed except for black, that it's being projected because it can't absorb that. That's the scientific expression of how light operates in the objects that we see. That same thing happens to us. What I actually perceive are the elements that I cannot take in myself. And this is a gift of nature to help us to see ourselves, because nature provides us the opportunity to awaken, but also provides us the choice, if we so take it, to fall to sleep. So it shows us this relationship of ourself so that we can see. And if we're conscious enough, we see the impression of the individual in relation to our own thought and feeling about it. And if we hold the correct proximity, comprehension arises. But when we're identified and we're feeling our impatience and we're acting through our impatience, which means we're also perceiving through impatience, then this person isn't being seen as they are. They're seen as an obstacle. They're seen as an obstacle for my gratification of my senses, which is to get done what I wish to do. So I'm not seeing the person as a person, I'm seeing them as an obstacle. And this isn't completely thought through and everything, but it's the way that it's happening, the process inside of our minds when we're engaged and identified with impatience, or we're identified such as with sexuality and lust, then we see people as objects. When we're identified with pride, we see them as objects. And this is something that we can't just take in intellectually. We take it in intellectually as an idea, then let it go and observe and go through the day and notice what happens when I engage with an individual in a negative state, what comes up. Now, the great thing is it's not bad that these things come up because it allows us to comprehend. But if I'm not conscious and I'm identified with my impatience, I do not comprehend this, and I do not free myself, which takes us back to the work of chiseling that stone that is the foundation of our work, that you don't chisel the stone by adding things to it, you chisel it by taking things away. We awaken the consciousness by removing the rough edges. But we can only do that by seeing them and comprehending in relation to the work that we're trying to do, and to work to bring out the piece of art that's hidden in the stone. And that stone is the matter of our physical life and our expression. So the need for us to do is to notice, and here's the very simple thing. Notice when I'm in a negative state. The teaching says when I'm in a negative state, I am perceiving through that eye, and I am perceiving actually that eye in relation to what I'm seeing. The objective is to lift our state to be conscious, to be above the waters of the subconscious, which means outside of that influence, we can see them, and then we are able to perceive that person not through our eye, but through the consciousness. And it has a dual relationship because it allows us also now to perceive that person as an essence. We perceive as an essence, and we perceive as an essence. I said the same thing, but I meant two different things, obviously. How we perceive that person as an essence. And then that automatically we have the hope of compassion, of gratitude, instead of seeing the person psychologically as an object. And in this work begins to take form in what we call in the Gnostic path the work of the first mountain, which is in the book of creation. It's the first dry land. And in the Egyptian traditions, it's the same thing, that they built their temples on the first dry land that emerged from the depths of the waters. And in the Egyptian tradition, they put that capstone, and from that they grew the benben on the first, it's called benben, or we say obelisk, on that first piece of dry land, which is the work of the spine. But that first piece of dry land that emerges is the process of psychologically working while sexually conserving and transmuting that energy. And we start to reform inside of ourselves something new. And in the teachings of the awakening of consciousness, this is called the work of the first mountain. And that first mountain is rebuilding a relationship to these first 5 sephira, which is to create mastery in those realms. We don't have time to go into all the process, but what I do want to talk about, and we'll go lead into this for next week, is that this mountain, as it were, is directly related to the energy that's trapped within the world of Malkuth, within the chakra of Muladhara, where the serpent 3.5 times, we'll go deeper in this next area, I know what you're thinking, 3.5 times around and unraveling, uncoiling the serpent is the work of processing through the first mountain, which is the first stages of the awakening of consciousness, and developing something like a mountain that's stable. And the mountain also is the natural pyramid. And we'll talk about this in the next course, that there are pyramids all throughout the planet. But not only that, in the more primitive cultures, they would build them out of earth, and they were mounds. That's always a symbol of a state of an elevated, superior level of consciousness. For some reason, it wants to go through this again. We'll let it do it. Let it do its thing. Now, to work through this, now brings us to this world of emanation, the world of Atziluth, which means proximity. And something very important to understand in this relationship of proximity, meaning that God, acting as the first origin that emerged from the Absolute, said, I am. And in the Hebrew, the word in the name of God in this first Sephirah that emerged out of the Absolute is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I am that which I am. It's the first statement that we make when we're awake and aware of who we are and where we are. I am here. I am doing. I am walking. The being says, I am creation. I am creating. And at that superior level, the proximity is right to the origins of all life and creation. For us to approach that, we need to establish ourselves in those lower worlds and create through the process of the first mountain, building a mountain that reaches up. And the mountain's a symbol, of course, but that our consciousness reaches up to communicate. Like Moses went up on Mount Sinai to communicate directly to the divine. And that's where the name Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh comes from, because Moses asked, when I return back to the world, what should I tell the people your name is? And the divine responded, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. The Gnostic equivalent of this is the words that Master Samael tells us, that the reason of being for the being is being itself. We gather knowledge and information as a byproduct of being. I am, therefore I think. Who I am, what I am, dictates how I conceptualize myself and the world. It's not the other way around. My perceptions don't tell me who I am. We need to be awake to know who I am, to have the proximity to the divine. And we do that by removing all of our attachments psychologically to the world that we're expressing in. Very beautifully, and inversely, the words of Dante Alighieri, he gives as a definition of hell is proximity without intimacy. To be in proximity of, but not have an intimate connection. And actually, that in essence is part of the pain and the difficulty of all of this world that we can't quite put our fingers on, that we are in the proximity of something divine. When we see a tree, when we see a bird, when we see a sunrise, that awe is, we are in the proximity of something divine when we stare up into the heavens, but we don't have that intimacy. We're seeing it outside of ourselves, away from ourselves. We're seeing it in other individuals, but we don't recognize it. We don't have the intimate relationship. So the necessity for us is to have an intimate relationship. And that's why in this world of Bria, when the creation unfolds from the Absolute, here we are, from the Absolute into these three primary forces, this Trinity then unfolds into this Trinity. This is where we have the intimate connection or the intimate relationship of the divine. Any of us can experience that intimate relationship in an experience with the being. That is our mediator or intermediator between the world of Atziluth that's accessible to us until we create and fabricate the solar bodies, which are done in the first mountain that we've talked about. Then we can have a relationship, and we'll talk more about that next week, to have a vehicle through which the actual Godhead itself, which we call in Gnosis Christ, in the East it's called Krishna, or last week we said Avalokiteshvara, to have that intimate relationship, we have to first completely remove all the obstacles from that and build a temple so that that divine can then dwell in it. And in the stories of Moses, it first began as building a tabernacle in the wilderness so that I can dwell among my people. And it was built in a threefold formation. And you can look into that if you're so inspired. But the esoteric information that comes through for that is for us to understand that threefold is in our mind, to have it open, in our heart, to be expressing and not closed as well, to have the mind empty, the heart opened, and to be conscious of our actions, where we are. That way, and then as we crystallize through the sexual energy, a permanent center of gravity that then allows this Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which is cosmic, to become intimate or personalized. As you see these lines here, it allows it to be born in unison with the human soul. So we are in a perpetual state of suffering, which in Buddhism they say the world of samsara is the world of suffering, where we are because we're tied to craving, aversion, and ignorance, which means we are in proximity of the divine, but we don't have intimacy with the divine. And the more we turn away from that wanting, the further and further away we get from that intimate connection. So in Gnosis, we're really working to find that intimacy through the first forces that we were talking about. Now imagine we lived on a planet that we did not have an atmosphere to transfer or transform the energy of the sun into heat, into light. Remember, we showed the relationship of the earth and the sun and the water producing life. But imagine a world where we didn't have that atmosphere. We could see the sun, but we couldn't transfer it into life. Now, imagine the extreme of that, where actually the opposite. Instead of not having the atmosphere to transfer it into light and heat, we have an atmosphere that's inverse and inverts that and creates skin cancer and creates gases that are destroying the planet. And you start to get an insight to where we are as a planet. What's happening is the symbol that's always been of God is becoming the thing that's working in destruction for this planet. The global warming and the ice caps are melting because our atmosphere has been destroyed. But this is a reflection of the psychological atmosphere that we as physical entities aren't able to transfer and transform the force of the being of God inside of ourselves into love. So the symbol in the east of this is Brahma, and here Brahma has three faces that are facing us and a fourth face that faces the Absolute. That is perpetually not only connected, but perceiving divine abstract space. And that he is seated upon this throne. And we'll look at this throne next week, but it's also this throne, this cubic stone that's been formed through the work that gives a place for the being to rest. So here's where we're going to conclude, and we're going to do a practice. We're going to do a practice. I'm going to read, I'm going to summarize that there's an ancient Gnostic, because I can't read it up here, it's text that communicates this teaching that says, the great Gnostic priest intoned a sweet hymn in praise of the great name and said to his disciples, come to me. This is the Christ speaking. Come to me. And they did. Then he addressed the four cardinal points, which are the four directions, which is relation to the physical world. He extended his serene gaze and pronounced the profoundly sacred name, Yeu, which is later has been translated as the word Yu or Jew, but it's the three syllables, E, A, U. He blessed them, blew in their eyes, and said, look, you're clairvoyant. So we're going to work with this practice, which is the E, A, U, relates to the superior parts of this tree of life, which is, where am I? Here we are. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, E, A, U. And we can see it, how it relates to cleansing and purifying our mind, E, our actions, A, and our lower emotions, U. And then we're going to conclude with the synthesis of this, which is the Om.
And those, the E, the A, and the U, for those who've studied the chakras with us, those are sounds that help to stimulate particular chakras in relation to the mind and the throat chakra, the Vishuddha, and our capacity to listen, and also therefore to speak and have power to the word and our actions as well. And then U related to the solar plexus and the lower emotion. So E, A, U. So they help us with that. Yeah. And in the mantra, Ju also helps to stimulate the consciousness in terms of self-observation and self-remembering. So that could be a mantra that we even carry silently to help us to stay in the moment. I mean, give your mind something, because otherwise it's usually wandering.
You don't occupy it, it becomes preoccupied.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So if you need to stretch for a moment, please do. The practice will be not too long. We just want to create the inspiration and set the tone for the practice. It's based on the four-part breathing and the transmutation that we talked about before, which is what we'll begin with. So if you need to take a quick break, do that. But for those of us that are present and here, let us begin to breathe and relax. Beginning to regulate our breath as we breathe in, pause, relax, absorb, breathe out. Pause, relax, absorb, breathe in. Pause, relax, absorb, breathe out. And now let us add to this the awareness of our mind on the energy from the base of the spine, receiving the energy of the sexual organs, and we breathe in and see this as light rising up the spine to the top of the head as we relax and assimilate. Pause, and then send it to the heart. Whether we're saying the mantras or not, Ham Sa, we're just visualizing this and ultimately, more importantly, feeling. It should be an emotional exercise, stimulating gratitude, love, and moving this energy through the body. Continue breathing, transmuting. Prayer and meditation work in a beautiful harmony. We know that it's possible. We have a sort of a concept of prayer that we hope to remove in this moment, because prayer is really just an attitude of superior emotion. As we heard, the being emerges from the absolute creation and says, I am that which I am. In essence, he is. The active step out. So the attitude for us to connect with this divine presence is to be. We all wish to feel the love of God, either as an idea or just as an emptiness in our life that can only be filled by the divine. But the way that we can feel the love of the being of God is by loving. It is an active state. So the attitude of prayer that we need is to be. And the mind, it's to be in union, to be in love, to be that which I am, without a concept or an image of what that is, completely empty in the mind, open in the heart, and relaxed in the physical body, with the attitude of wanting, longing to be. To be with the being. To be with the divine. To be with the source of all light, love, and creation. Making the effort only to not deviate with our awareness, to not get caught in resistance or ideas or concepts. Let those be a reminder to let go and relax and be. To be in love. Love is. We long to be in proximity, intimately, with this divine attribute, which is freely given to us. Unclench the mind. Don't be confused, be. Let confusion go. Let fear go. Let go and be. And with this, we use the mantra to connect to the highest parts of this love in creation. We inhale and return this creative energy up the spine to the crown. And then in a breath, we let out. Inhale. Pause, relax. The objective is to be, which means not to think, not to identify with an emotional state, not to be taken away by a sound or a sensation in the body, to come to equanimity, concentrating in the present moment, but open to the possibility that there is infinitely more here than I perceive at this moment. And we wish to be in proximity and make an intimate connection. We're longing for the intimacy of the being to contact our hearts, that we have opened, emptied for this. Again, we've opened the crown, the mind, relax the body, and oriented our emotional center towards the superior state of consciousness. We now recite the superior form of the great syllable Om, which is the first point of creation, with this continued longing for intimacy with the being, the Christic light. We recite in 3 parts, Ah, U, which is to now, in the place of the relaxed body, empty mind, and open heart, we deposit these 3 superior forces with gratitude and thankfulness. We receive as we recite. So this is where we're going to bring a close to the practice.